Good people of the Grove. Hey, growth group. It's like week 6 of Second Corinthians, but a whole lot of weeks that we've been doing growth groups here in 2024 coming to an end as we wrap up these beautiful and yet troubling letters that Paul wrote to the church at Corinth. Man, I don't know how you've been stirred so far, but my prayer is that this week, this really isn't just a growth group video. This is a video for all of us because we need generosity these days. We need generosity practically in our church. We need generosity in our world. And fun fact, did you know that the word for generosity is also the word for kindness in the New Testament? Not always, but most of the time it's the same root word. And it's kind of interesting that you will not be generous unless you have a kind heart towards your brethren. The stingiest people in the world are usually the grumpiest. Those two things go hand in hand. That's just a little bonus point. Now for the fun of 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and 9, which actually is the New Testament's longest discourse on generosity that we have. Jesus didn't even preach or write on generosity as much or as lengthy as this particular passage. Paul is very exhaustive in his understanding of the New Testament, and yet he does not mention percentages in his discourse here. He does not talk about a tithe, and here's why. One, it wasn't the point of what he was trying to get at with this passage. I'll get to the point in a minute. But two, it is assumed that this would be their practice, that they would be giving everything. Actually, that's the normal practice of the New Testament church, that they were giving everything to the church, laying it at the apostles' feet, selling everything they had so that they would distribute it to all who have need daily. Go read Acts chapter 2, a pivotal verse for our church. Acts chapter 2, verses 42 through 47, if you want to see what's normal. We don't live in that kind of world. I wish we did. It would be interesting, and yet I think it would very much challenge our loyalties. And I think that's really the point of this passage. So here's the background of the passage of 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, is that there is a famine going on in Jerusalem at the time. And ultimately, Paul has planted these churches all over, and as he's planted, he's told them about the famine, and they've grown to love the church in Jerusalem, the saints all over the world, and they have come up with an opportunity and a conviction to give to the saints in Jerusalem, to give to their need, to make sure that out of what they have, according to their means, that they would give faithfully, not just to their local church, not just to their local congregation, not just to the local community, but also to the community of Christians across the world, such as Jerusalem. Now, Paul writes to them and he says, look, I am so looking forward to coming to you, but you know all the background of 2 Corinthians, and then he has some really hard conversation with them, and then what does he do? He turns to money. Man, I love Paul because he tackles all the hard things and all the hard ways, and he does it beautifully. And the way that he does it here is that he says, hey, look, there's the Macedonian church, which is just across the way here. And I have been telling them all about how you can't wait to be generous to the saints in Jerusalem. This is what the first part of 9 is. But the first part of 8 is, and let me tell you about that Macedonian church. When they heard about your generosity, when they heard about what your pledge was for them, their generosity was magnificent. It was just an outpouring of generosity for the church at Jerusalem. And I just want you to look at them as an example on how we can give and receive not just material goods, but God's grace. That's how he starts this in chapter 8, verse 1. We want you to know, brothers, about the grace of God that has been given among the churches of Macedonia. When we are generous, we are sacrificing some comforts, but we are also giving grace to one another. It's really beautiful how God articulates that through his servant Paul. So 2 Corinthians 8, 1 through 15 is really this example of the Macedonian church. And then he goes into really this long discourse of Titus and the other workmen who had accompanied Titus. They have different gifts. They have different this and that. One's really good at preaching. Titus, you'll know, he has a heart for you just like I do. I mean, he is basically saying, hey, Titus has come basically to prepare the way before I get there, so that when I get there, the offering's going to be ready. You may be reluctant. I've heard of your reluctance due to all this difficult conversation we've had amongst us, you Corinthians and me, Paul. You may be thinking that maybe you don't want to be generous anymore. Well, Titus has come to reiterate that we give out of cheerful hearts because of what God has done for us and not because of how we feel about any certain leader at any given time. And that would have been normal and that would have been natural. And that's natural for us, isn't it? So Titus was there to lay the groundwork so that when Paul comes, they would have and be ready to give that gift to the Jerusalem church. That's kind of the whole idea here in these two chapters. And then he goes on to say, now let me tell you about the kind of heart that God loves when we're giving. It's a cheerful one. It's a hilarious. You're overflowing in joy when you are able to contribute to the saints. And I don't know if that's your story, but it's certainly been ours, that the more we give and the more we're generous, the more joy that we get from that generosity. Anytime that I don't give, feel a little guilty, or anytime I haven't in the past, I feel a little guilty about that. I feel real guilty about that. I had a conversation recently with someone that was like, I just feel guilty, we're not giving. I was like, well, quit feeling guilty, give. It's just that simple. Be obedient to the scriptures to give generously, right? But in chapter 9, it gives you the cheerful heart. It also gives you a prescription on how to have a general heart, which is very odd that God would give a prescription to that end. It's right there in verse 7. And then he gives an example of a farmer that basically, like if you look at it, it's really beautiful. And I'll unpack it actually as we go through the question. So 3 questions, right? What does this say about God? What does this reveal about me? And then what must I do as a result? I think there are a few things this reveals about God. In chapter 8, verse 9, it says ultimately this about Jesus. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich in heaven, he was rich in praise, he was rich on the throne, he was rich in every way possible. Though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that by his poverty you might become rich. So the beautiful thing in all this is like he was spiritually rich, and he gave up his spiritual richness to then become sin for us, so that we were the poor ones spiritually, and we gained spiritually. And he uses this spiritual principle in material ways, that he applies it to our wallets and says, look, this is a gospel issue. This is a heart issue. Your generosity is a heart issue. That's what this reveals about God, ultimately, that this is all rooted in how he has loved us. Chapter 9, verse 7, it says that he loves a cheerful giver. I've already mentioned this even as we've gone through it. He sees generosity as a gospel issue rooted back in chapter 8. Wow, that was a sneeze. Verse 9. I'm not going to redo the video. That was just a gift to you. Chapter 9, verses 8 and 9, it goes on to say, he will supply all that we need when we are generous. He will not supply all that we want for greed's sake. He will supply all that we need for generosity's sake. Read that verse, verses 8 and 9 of chapter 9, and look at what it says. And God is able to make all grace, all grace, abound, meaning like explode in how much you have, to you, so that having all sufficiency in all things at all times, that you may abound in every good work. When we participate in God's kingdom and give generously to his purposes, this is his promise, that he's able to give us everything we ever need for every good work. We will not lack one thing along the way. What a beautiful promise that God has given us. And then finally, chapter 9, verses 12 and 13, God gets glory when we are generous, and that glory multiplies. Look again at verses 12 and 13. It's really beautiful. 12 and 13 of 9. For the ministry of this service is not only supplying the needs of the saints, that's beautiful, but is also overflowing in many thanksgivings to God. By their approval of this service, they will glorify God because of your submission. Oh, there's that word again. Flowing from your confession of the gospel of Christ and the generosity of your contribution for them and for all the others. Here's the idea. You can submit to God, or you can submit to yourself in ways of finances. If we submit to God, not only does it minister to the saints, but now it multiplies gratitude and thanksgiving unto God, which give God glory. One of the best ways that you can give God glory, friends, is by showing gratitude to him for the debt that he paid, for the penalty he paid for your debt. That's all financial terms, but it's wrapped up in verse 9 of chapter 8 in spiritual terms. But it's all to help us understand that we are not to be tightwads because God was not a tightwad with us, and that he gave us his son Jesus. And so how will we respond? And he goes on to say, man, this is the way God gets glory, is through our generosity and thanksgiving and the service to the saints materially, financially. It's beautiful, this chapter. Now, what does this reveal about us? What does this text reveal about humans? Well, in chapter 8, verses 8 through 11, what we will find is that the main reason that Paul is writing is because they made a pledge about a year prior. And, things have gone by, and I got to tell you, I had to get my roof repaired, and my fence fell down during barrel, and I had some expenses with that softball team, and, I didn't get the raise I was going to get, and a year goes by, and maybe I don't want to give that pledge anymore. Yeah, well, Paul's going to have something to say about that. But it reveals to us in chapter 8, verses 8 through 11, we are slow to make good on our commitments, especially with money. Why he says in verse 11, so now finish doing it as well. Don't just say that you're ready to do it. Finish doing it so that your readiness in desiring it may be matched by completing it out of what you have. In other words, do what you say and say what you do. Do what you mean what you say what you mean, that whole thing, you know what I'm talking about. What the bottom line here is really in chapter 9, verse 4, and he says this, otherwise, if some Macedonians come with me and find that you are not ready to give that gift, we would be humiliated. We've been bragging about you and your generosity all over town. If you don't want to give, man, that would humiliate us because it would show that you've changed your mind, or that you're really not that generous. You could say one thing, but it needs to be backed up with action. He goes on to say, we would be humiliated, to say nothing of you, for being so confident. Ultimately, he's saying this, give the gift, not out of compulsion. It's actually in verse 5, I meant to note down, my apologies. He goes on to say this. So I thought it necessary to urge the brothers to go on ahead to you and arrange in advance for the gift that you have promised, so that it may be ready as a willing gift, not as an exaction. You'd want to do it, and it's not a duty. It's really beautiful in how God does this and how he is warning and yet encouraging all at the same time. There is both in all of these passages. All right, secondly, fairness. In chapter 8, verse 14, what does it reveal about us? Fairness, he goes on to say, this is a matter of fairness. In other words, look, in your times of abundance, you can give to the needs of others. And in their times of abundance, they will give in your need. And what he's helping us understand is that we need to normalize interdependent relationships that are symbiotic, that they're interdependent and they're symbiotic, that they get something from one another, and that we are interdependent, not independent. We don't live like this today. We are trained to live independently, where we don't need anyone or anything until it's really desperate, and then we got to reach out. That is not the way of Jesus, certainly not the way of our finances. Finally, what does it reveal about us? We are called to have a life that matches our confession. In verse 13 of chapter 9, very obvious that the way and the reason why they are giving thanks in Jerusalem after all this time, when the gift finally shows up, it says this in verse 13, by their approval of this service, they will glorify God because of your submission flowing from your confession of the gospel of Christ and the generosity of your contribution for them and all the others. In other words, your confession of Christ, your belief of the gospel matches your life. What you said that you would do is what you actually did. Why is that such a big deal? In Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, he says, let your yes be yes and your no be no. Anything other than this comes from the evil one, from the devil, or is evil. Let your word be your bond. If you say something, friends, do it. I'll get to this in a minute. I'll unpack that in just a minute. But let me finish up this part. That's what it says about us. That's what I think it reveals about us. All right, finally, about 3 or 4 things here about what must I do. I'll be quick. Follow through with your word. Make your word your bond. Out of chapter 8, verses 10 through 11. Chapter 8, verse 15. Savings is good and right. Nothing wrong with planning for the future. But at some point, we must limit what our standard of living is, which is why Paul used the quote from Exodus 16 in chapter 8, verse 15. As if to say, he's basically saying, this is what he says. He's like, as it is written, whoever gathered much had nothing left over, and whoever gathered little had no lack. In other words, they had everything they need when they were gathering manna, And then if you go on to read that passage, it says, don't take more than you need. It will spoil. As one commentator said, excess is toxic. Friends, it might be time to not just clean out your closet, but like do an audit of your budget, because you may be saving for something that is toxic for your soul. You need to understand that. The American dream has become such a thing. Retirement has been such a thing. Land has become such a thing that it's like normative for us to be like, oh, sounds awesome. What if it's not, though? What if it's not for our soul? What if it's toxic? What if it's excess? What if it's something that God's warning us against? Have we considered that? Maybe we should. Chapter 9, verse 7, again, and this is where I want to just end here. If you're a partner or if you are a guest here, if this is your home, whether you're a partner or not, but specifically for partners, you signed an agreement to give generously and sacrificially and faithfully. And we have then gone back to say, like, just so you know, that doesn't mean things out of the Old Testament. It also means first fruit before taxes. It also means at least 10% as the baseline of our generosity. It hedges against greed. It hedges against all sorts of selfishness. It promotes a kingdom mindset. It tells me that I'm making a difference here with my money. It also helps me understand, like, I'm bought into this place and this place matters to me. It matters to God. There's all sorts of benefits to the why we do what we do. But here's what God says to do in chapter 9, verse 7. Decide to do it and do it ahead of time. Make your mind up and follow through. Don't do it from reluctancy or out of regret. Don't do it under compulsion or out of duty because you think you have to. That doesn't honor God. He wants you to do it because you want to, because you see the value of generosity, because you understand how generous God was with his son. Hey, look, God loves this because it shows we trust him, that we prioritize kingdom things, and that we are fighting against greed, just as Luke chapter 12, verse 15 has to say, right? He says to this is what Jesus says here at the end, like he said to them, watch out, be on guard against all kinds of greed, for a man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. May that be the warning, and then may that be the invitation out of 2 Corinthians, that we would give cheerfully and beautifully, and that thanksgiving and praise and glory would be given to God as a result. Love you. See you soon.